you so much for joining us for EPRI's third Social Cost of Greenhouse Gases public educational webcast. For those of you who are less familiar with EPRI, we are a nonprofit, non-advocacy scientific research organization, and our work is driven by our public benefit mission to advance public knowledge. This webcast series is designed to provide education on topics related to the social cost of carbon, raise awareness about technical issues and challenges within the estimation and application of these values, and provide deeper insight into this very complex topic. Our first webcast in this series provided a foundational baseline on the social cost of carbon, focusing on defining the social cost of carbon, discussing how the social cost of carbon is currently estimated and valued, and technical challenges related to current estimates and future methodologies. The second webcast discussed technical issues for the use of estimates in rulemaking and other potential federal and state applications. And today's webcast will focus specifically on the role of discounting in social cost of carbon calculations and applications and technical issues that are important to recognize and consider. For additional details and materials from these other webcasts, please see our website. I will also drop the link to the website in the chat in just a minute. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our MC and moderator for today's webcast, Professor John Wayans. Dr. Wayans is a professor of management science and engineering and the director of the Energy Modeling Forum at Stanford University. John has been a founding father and driving force in energy systems and integrated assessment modeling and in multi-sector dynamics research since the 1980s. He served on the National Academies Committee for assessing approaches to updating the social cost of carbon and has been an IPCC convening lead author, a lead author, and a review editor. And he also co-edited the seminal book, Discounting and Intergenerational Equity with Professor Paul Portney. So without further ado, let me pass it over to John to take us into today's interesting and important topic.
Thanks very much, Heidi, for that gracious introduction. I'm kind of the timekeeper moderator today, so I'll try to keep it brief. I will say my interest in the discount rate issue goes way back to summer internship days in the 1980s at Rand Corporation, where I was asked by someone to figure out why the different programs, even within RAND, let alone different parts of the government or different countries, were using different discount rates. I then picked up my interest more aggressively in working on the book you see on your screen with Paul Portney. So I would say for me, on a bad day, I find the subject totally frightening because it's so complicated and difficult to sort out what might be important and useful in a practical sense. On a good day, though, and I think that's why we're probably all here, I actually feel good about struggling with it because it is, as we'll quickly demonstrate, such an important element of a lot of policy analysis, not least of which is climate change with the long time horizons. Next slide. Am I? Yeah, so our illustrious panel today, and I'm totally excited. I think this group has probably done a fair share of the new thinking and new work since the book we edited in 1999 consists of Steve Rose from the Electric Power Research Institute, our host here today, Deborah Lucas from MIT, and Billy Pizer from Resources of the Future. These people are well known to you. I'll do a bit of more of a formal introduction in a few more slides. Next slide, Heidi. So just for background, for some of you who are kind of trying to orient this talk within the other talks that EPRI has sponsored and within the debate and discussion regarding the social cost of carbon, it is a very important, the social cost of greenhouse gases is a very important thing to think about. It's essentially the discounted present value of additional greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere. As I'll demonstrate on the left side, the way it's been done illustrates how significant the discount rate used is for determining the results obtained at any point in time. It is a complicated topic. I felt, once again, in reviewing for this session and discussing it with the panel members, that you could bring in almost all modern micro and macroeconomics, a little bit of financial economics and decision theory all into one big ball of complicated wax. I would say in terms of the way particularly the interagency working group, which is the dominant group that's done the estimates for the US government, it is just one of many methodological issues. On the bottom of the page, a diagram produced by Steve Rose that we picked up in our National Academy review that is kind of a 4-box model where you have socioeconomic scenarios, then you look at the influence of an additional pulse of emissions, how that affects global mean temperature, how that downscales to regional temperature and regional impacts, including, as an example here, sea level rise. And then you get your climate damages through some kind of damage functions, and you discount the or integrate, do the discounted integral between the two lines. Next slide. So in the recent history, I would say, following on from the previous two administrations, the Biden administration is updating the estimates of the social cost of carbon using the methodology developed initially by the Interagency Working Group as modified and amended via various feedbacks that the group received. You can see on the bottom two panels the extreme sensitivity to discount rates of interest. You see on the right-hand column the implications of a 95th percentile damage function point with a 3% discount. For completeness, we show on the top a New York State thing, which took some of the lower values from the IWG work and actually put in a 0% discount rate. Interesting topic for discussion is why the numbers go so high. Are they reasonable and consistent? I'm sure our panel might have some comments on that. I would say in terms of bounding things a little bit, we're going to start and partially finish with the bounding this discussion towards the IWG work and the use by the US government of the social cost of carbon and discounting related to it in a federal application, which is regulatory-like. So it is not a broad discussion at this point, although the panel may get into these subjects about other related issues, including but not limited to the optimal price on carbon that balances discounted net benefits and discounted or marginal benefits and costs. Next slide, Heidi. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with the discount debate, we'll start with something really simple, which this illustrious group will build upon pretty rapidly. But just to get you oriented just a little bit, we could ask the question, why do, back one slide, why do individuals discount or individual companies? You could stretch it a little bit. In investing, they need to compare cash flows at different points of time, kind of money in and out. Usually in an investment decision, you put some money out now and you hope to get some return through either return on investment, which could in this case be reduced climate impacts over time. So you need to figure out some way to compare them. Social cost of carbon is actually one way to think about doing that. So why do they feel, why do people illustrate this behavior? First of all, it was proven back in the late 1890s by a couple of researchers in Austria initially that they actually prefer a fixed amount of money now rather than later. So if you tell somebody in a year or 5 years you're going to get $1, and what would you be willing to accept today in lieu of that uncertain future thing? Usually they'll say somewhat less, a few percent less, at least even over a period of a year or two or three. This is partially explained by the fact that people don't know what the future will bring, including whether or not they'll actually be around to participate in consumption in that distant period. The other part of this that goes back to at least Irving Fisher, if not all the way back to the 1890s, the 1930s back to the 1890s, is one reason they may value money more now than later is they could take the money, invest it, and then have more money getting hopefully a return on investment. Hopefully is a condition there though, so they also need to consider in that calculation and in the impatience, as I've already indicated, the riskiness of the returns on investment. So somewhere you have to bring that in. I would say, and we'll see a correction to this in the panel today, we've probably spent a little bit less time thinking consistently about how that might work out. We also know from portfolio theory and other things that and actually basic decision theory, risk assessments may depend on the payoffs and risk of the other investments that the individual has in mind. If it's a bet you're bet your life, bet your company thing, that's a little bit different than if it's a small decision that doesn't affect the marginal utility rates very much. Now, when you get to groups like governments or groups of people of any sort, you have to add to this list who is in the group, who are the getting the cost and benefits, whether and how to factor in societal preferences, and whether the investment is a private or public good, including importantly the distinction between the two that people often bring in at that point, and that is the role of taxation as either a cost to a private sector individual or a transfer payment on the part of the government. So next slide. So now I'd like to introduce our illustrious panel who will greatly expand upon this very simplistic list of issues, add to it, and then try to clarify and give us some guidance about what to do and where we go from here. First, we have Steve Rose, one of our hosts, who's a senior research economist in energy systems and climate analysis at EPRI. Steve and I go back quite a way. He's actually led some Energy Modeling Forum studies for the Energy Modeling Forum, most recently the Advanced Biofuel Studies that's just recently been almost completely published. Steve has done a lot of work on both the mitigation and the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability of climate. And I believe at present, he's actually in both sides of that in the IPCC, something I did back in the year 2000 and still have not recovered from. But Steve is younger and more resilient than me, so I'm sure he'll be fine. He was joining Billy and myself on this National Academy Review panel of the work of the IWG in 2015-16 and released in early 2017. He has many other responsibilities and advisory board members. Secondly, we have Billy Pizer, who again was on our National Academy Committee and now is on the Deep Decarbonization National Academy Committee, which is not directly a follow-up, but probably follows up on some of the ideas there. Billy was actually always trying to do brand new research, as Steve and I can report during our committee. Billy is currently Vice President of Research and Policy Engagement Resources of the Future. Many of us know him before that as a endowed professor at the Public Policy School at Duke University, and even before that, and relevant here, a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Environment at the United States Treasury Department. And last but not least, and probably our broadest thinking person on this issue, I predict on this panel, we have Deborah Lucas, who's a distinguished professor of finance and director of the MIT Center for Finance and Policy at the Sloan School of Management. Deborah, as our other two panelists, has both a long experience in the academic kind of research on this topic, but also a strong dose of practical experience using some of the theoretical concepts in a practical setting. She was in many positions, starting with chief economist through assistant and associate director of the Congressional Budget Office, senior staffer at the Council of Economic Advisors, on the Shadow Open Market Committee, senior fellow at NBR, a bunch of other responsibilities like that, and previously a professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Steve Rose to give us his presentation. Each panelist will have approximately 15 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully about half an hour, probably a little bit less at this point, for Q&A from the audience. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here today. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts when we get to the discussion section. So let me just start by saying discounting is a topic that's not familiar to everyone. And for those of you that are less familiar with it, it can be pretty tough sledding. There are many complex issues that come up in the context of discussing discounting, and it can be difficult to follow the conversations that occur because there are multiple complex issues that are being discussed simultaneously. With that in mind, EPRI has been doing some work trying to unpack this discounting space and decompose discounting into a series of questions. We think this is a valuable path forward for a number of reasons. One, it's been particularly helpful to us in terms of being able to structure our own thinking and work through this topic. Two, we think it can be very helpful to others, which is why I'm sharing it today. Three, it provides some tractable questions. So it allows us to essentially identify individual questions and work through those questions one at a time and focus on being able to sort of follow that series and think about where it takes us in terms of the scientific evidence in answering each of those questions. And lastly, it provides us with some structure for identifying where there's agreement with respect to each of these questions and where there might be disagreement so that we can have some concerted conversations about particularly those areas where there's still disagreement. So what's here is essentially that list of questions that we're working with now. It starts with the most basic of questions on whether or not we need to discount at all. Then it talks about thinking about the possibilities for discounting, thinking about whether or not policy objectives or policy preferences should be incorporated into discounting, addressing whether or not we need consistency with other cost-benefit calculations, considering constant discounting versus dynamic discounting, which will make sense to you more in a little bit. If constant discounting is appropriate, what are the potential options? If dynamic discounting is appropriate, again, what are the options where there's actually a few more questions there? So we need to think about how we'll actually calibrate the discounting formulation when we're trying to think about it in dynamic terms. And lastly, thinking about uncertainty, which actually has a variety of different dimensions, and you'll hear me talk about a couple of them, but you'll also hear the other panelists bring up some other aspects of uncertainty. So the idea here is really just to provide, like I said, some tractable questions that allow us to then kind of work through those questions in a systematic way and hopefully identify kind of where there's more agreement and where there's less agreement and where potentially we need new knowledge to be able to advance. So I'm going to focus on not quite all of these questions today, and I'm just going to really be touching upon some of what we've been learning and what it means today. And that's not to say that the top two questions here aren't important. We've already heard John talk about sort of why we need to discount to simply the fact that people view future consumption differently than current consumption. And they clearly are making decisions that show that they are discounting that future consumption. Second of all, we can see that there's many possible discount rates out there. And I'll just simply say that we need to then think about the fact that they represent different flavors of discounting. And so there's different criteria that we want to bring to bear in terms of helping us evaluate those alternatives for discounting and identifying which are the most appropriate for our particular context here. So that's just a couple quick responses in terms of those top two questions. And like I said, I'm going to focus on the rest of these and give you a feel for sort of what the answers might look like for each of these questions. So I'm going to jump right in terms of incorporating policy goals into discounting and give you the punchline here, and that is that it's problematic. What we need when we're thinking about social cost of greenhouse gas estimates is estimates that provide objective information into our decision process. So they're informing us in terms of evaluating the implications of a particular proposed policy or other kind of action. So with that in mind, as we think about potentially bringing in policy considerations such as intergenerational equity, or we're thinking about how do we compare current generations to future generations or other considerations, we begin to lose that quality of having objective information that's informing those policy decisions. That kind of policy consideration is sometimes referred to as prescriptive discounting. And so a couple arguments against prescriptive discounting in this context. So one is that we need to be thinking about the trade-offs that society has revealed they're willing to make. So we can look out in markets and see in other kinds of behavior how people are willing to behave. Two, as I mentioned, we need estimates that will inform policy, not necessarily be about making policy. We want to include those decisions with respect to our policy preferences in our policy stringency and design, but not necessarily in the metrics used to evaluate those policies. And lastly, it can create some instability in terms of estimates going forward. As we think about having policy preferences inside the estimates in one way or another, whether it's through the discounting or otherwise, it then means that there's some likelihood of those estimates changing simply because of changing those parameter values with different governments over time. In terms of costs and benefits consistency, it's important for us to be thinking about it, and you'll hear the other panelists talk about this as well. Ideally, we want to be comparing benefits and costs in a consistent fashion in the most meaningful way. And ideally, that would be harmonizing the trade-offs that are being calculated in those different calculations. So whether it's calculating climate benefits or air quality benefits, energy security benefits, or compliance costs, or so on and so on, all those different calculations in some ways can be representing different kinds of trade-offs for society. Whether those trade-offs are being felt by consumers or being felt by the private sector matters. And being able to think about how can we harmonize that information in a way that facilitates our trade-offs, which would include thinking about possibly harmonizing the discount rates. There's a variety of different pieces of information out there where people are arguing for essentially this kind of consistency in discounting across costs and benefits. We can look to global models as an example of a particular quantitative framework where costs and benefits are brought together and see how discounting is handled in those frameworks. In that particular case, we see that single rates are used to bring together costs and benefits because those costs and benefits are being converted into a common trade-off that would allow us to apply that single rate. They're also applying dynamic discounting, which we'll talk about in a minute in that context. And we see the National Academies has flagged through the social cost of carbon work that John was referring to, has flagged this as an important issue and asked the interagency working group essentially to provide guidance on how to essentially bring together estimates that would take into account these kinds of differences in discounting and the way different calculations are being produced. To say a little bit about constant versus dynamic discounting, we've been doing some analysis evaluating the consistency of constant discount rates with future potential growth assumptions. And the bottom line here is they're not consistent. When we look at essentially a plausible alternative economic growth assumptions on a global basis or a regional basis, and we see what that implies in terms of identifying discounting that's consistent with it, we end up with something very different. What's shown here are just some examples where we're comparing constant discount rates. You see the dark black lines horizontally across each of these charts. And we're comparing the dynamic discounting that would be consistent with the economic growth assumptions that are currently used in the interim estimates for the Biden administration. We can see that the lines are very different, the colored lines from the black lines. And we can see in particular, as an example, that a 3% discount rate would essentially be under discounting of the estimates, particularly over the first century or century and a half, which is essentially the primary elements in any net present value calculation. So just to highlighting that importance of thinking about constant versus dynamic discounting and this kind of evidence suggesting that constant discounting is inconsistent with the kind of economic growth assumptions that we're assuming in the modeling. And that's at a global basis. We've also been making some comparisons at a regional basis and finding that consistency is even more pronounced. So as we consider how are we assuming different regions of the world will grow over time and think about discounting that would be consistent with those growth assumptions, we see this inconsistency to be even more pronounced than we saw at the global level. So recognizing that dynamic discounting seems to be the appropriate approach going forward for the kinds of calculations we're doing here, we then need to think about how do we calibrate that relationship. This brings us to something referred to as the Ramsey Equation. You'll hear Billy also refer to this. This is a particular equation that defines the relationship between the discount rate and economic growth. In particular, it's important to note that it's actually an intertemporal equilibrium condition. In other words, it's something that has to hold. It's describing to us the potential rate associated with future investments, the rate of return to future aggregate savings on one side relative to the rate associated with consumption. So we need to have an equilibrium condition that's balancing those two things over time, and that condition has to be consistent with the economic growth assumptions into the future. I'll get into the details of the parameters in just a minute, but there's a couple questions that come up when we're thinking about this equation and calibrating is one is what near-term rates do we think about? This would be setting the left-hand side to then help us calibrate the right-hand side. And then how do we then think about parameterizing the right-hand side? And in addition, we might also consider whether or not we want to consider calibration on a regional basis. So I'm going to work through particularly these two first questions. And then we'll give you some examples of calibrations. So what near-term rates should we be thinking about as being appropriate in this context? There's a number of considerations. One is focusing on observed rates. This is information that's available to us from markets and showing us revealed preferences, how people and society are already willing to make trade-offs over time. There's somebody who's talking, so if you put yourself on mute, that'd be great. Another is to think about whether or not we need risk-free rates. That's the typical assumption, and that's based on our thinking of the government as being a risk-neutral decision maker. But you'll hear Debbie say a little bit more about that later on in the panel. Another important consideration is trying to have compared to discount rates that are consistent or representative of the kind of investment that we're talking about when we're valuing the implications of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, for example, is a long-lived greenhouse gas. It lives in the atmosphere for approximately 100 years and has knock-on effects in terms of influencing the carbon cycle, and those inertia effects play out beyond 100 years. So we really need to be thinking out very long-run investments as our points of comparisons. So we're looking for observed rates for very long-run investments as potential opportunities for identifying what that near-term rate would look like. Some examples are 30-year treasuries, mortgages, Social Security as a program, as well as investments in nuclear power and nuclear waste, things that have very long time horizons. We're also interested in consistency with the type of trade-off that's being modeled. So as you think about what kinds of calculations we're doing within social cost of carbon estimation in terms of the economic damages that could be felt by society. And this is where we get into conversations about whether or not we're capturing effects on household consumption or on private investments. I would argue that we're typically not modeling consumption. To actually be modeling consumption effects would be modeling trade-offs between different types of consumption. Instead, in some cases, we're not modeling consumption at all, but instead we're actually modeling more macroeconomic trade-offs between consumption and investment, but not down in terms of individual choices between different types of consumption. A long data record is also important. Because of the time horizon we're projecting, which is multiple centuries, we need to be looking at historical data to help inform us that has as long a time horizon as possible. So we're not looking at rates associated with today or even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but really looking back as far as possible to see, to learn more about the potential variability in rates over time. Some examples, Social Security is shown on the bottom chart on the right, and you see another example from work that Billy Pizer did with Richard Newell in the middle with respect to long-run government bonds. We're also looking for consistency with economic growth. We talked about that equilibrium condition and the importance of that, and consideration of comparability with costs and benefits. So how do we think about trying to ensure that we're calculating costs and benefits that can be most readily compared and provide the most meaningful insights? Based on those kinds of considerations, thanks, John. Based on those kinds of considerations, we can narrow it down to a range of about 2 to 5%. But we actually, if we look more carefully at 2 to 3% and potential rates below that, we see there's a number of issues where we need to be concerned about those particular values. And one issue I'm going to talk about in just a second has to do with the calibration and whether or not we are able to produce valid calibrations of that dynamic discounting equation. I'll just comment real quickly about parameters here, and we can think about sort of parameterizing this equation. I'll talk specifically about the pure rate of time preference in yellow, that's the rho parameter, or the elasticity parameter, that's the eta parameter that's circled in blue there. And one particular thing to consider here is whether there might be constraints on parameterizing these particular values. And it's important for us to consider theory in this case, observational constraints, empirical estimates, and even past applications. When we take those things into account, we begin to see that there are constraints on how we think about this. Not only do we need to think about this as an equilibrium condition, so we're not simply plugging in values on the right to create something on the left, but we need to actually ensure that we are retaining that equilibrium condition and it's consistent with that economic growth over time. We also need to be thinking about, from a conceptual point of view, what do those parameters represent? And when we take that into account, the pure rate of time preference, that rho parameter represents how people are willing to trade off utility over time. The eta parameter represents the elasticity and marginal utility of consumption. That's whether or not the marginal value of consumption goes down with additional consumption. We can see that there's already some constraints. The pure rate of time preference needs to be greater than 0, and the elasticity parameter needs to be greater than 1. Those kinds of considerations in mind, we can explore different calibrations, and that's what we've been doing here. We're starting on the left of this table. We're looking at different near-term target discount rates, considering a particular growth rate assumption, and then exploring 3 different kinds of parameterizations for each of those near-term rates. where we choose either a middle level pure rate of time preference, a lower one for the calibration 1, or a higher one for calibration 2, and then we can set the corresponding elasticity. So I've highlighted for you in red a number of values that essentially run afoul of those constraints that we identified on the previous slide, and that essentially represents calibrations that would be invalid. So they're not consistent with theory and observations. And we want to take that into account in terms of this particular equation. And in particular, I'll highlight that rates below equal to or below 2% in the near term run into this problem in pretty much every single case. So just a couple of quick takeaways. One is it's problematic to incorporate policy preferences into discounting. The discounting consistency across costs and benefits calculations is important and something we need to be considering. That constant discount rates are clearly inconsistent with growth projections and economic theory, and that's something that needs to be corrected. That dynamic discounting calibration is something that should be constrained by theory observations and empirical evidence. And what we've seen from what we've done so far suggests that near-term rates of 3 to 5% are really the candidate space and potentially could be constrained further with other additional evidence. And dynamic discounting is something that we need to be, needs to vary not only with respect to time and potentially region, but also with respect to socioeconomic scenario. And as we think about potential societies like the chart on the upper right shows you, potential per capita consumption in the US, what would that imply in terms of the discount rates when you're considering dynamic discounting? And we see the implications here, just as food for thought in the chart below that, where we actually get essentially a lot of variability in the discounting over time that has to do with variability in the per capita consumption growth rate over time. And lastly, I'll just call out the importance of socioeconomic projections in social cost of greenhouse gas calculations overall. They're important not only in terms of projecting future emissions and thinking about future climate, they're important in terms of the societies that we're thinking might be exposed to climate change. And now you can clearly see it's important in terms of impacting the discounting. Thanks, John.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve, for kicking us off in such good style. I think you've set up a lot of issues that Billy and Deborah will build on. So next, I'd like to call on Billy Pizer to take us through the next segment of this relay. Billy.
Great. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. I switched to my phone. I just wanted to make sure that that was all cool.
Yeah, you're loud and clear on my end.
Okay, great. Let me just turn on the video too. Okay, so I am going to be talking about the U.S. government discounting policy and the social cost of carbon and some recent work at RFF. For those of you who are not familiar with Resources for the Future, we are a 70-year-old research organization here in Washington that focuses on improving decision-making on environment, energy, and natural resource issues through impartial economic research. And some of that research I'll be talking about today. I'd also just like to briefly thank Stephen and EPRI for inviting me here. It's also great to be on such a distinguished panel with John and Deborah. Let me just, I should also note the work I'm summarizing here is first a paper with Richard Newell and Brian Press, and then also work I did with a graduate student when I was at Duke, Ching-Ran Lee, who's now at a school in upstate New York. I'm forgetting the name. Anyway, let me jump right into this. Am I advancing the slides? Yes, great. Okay, so just to kind of set the stage, there are two questions I'm going to be focusing on. One are two problems that I'm going to be talking about. One is that current U.S. policy, as Steve was saying, whether you look at Circular A4, which is kind of the general guidance for the federal government, or the interagency working group, is to use a constant discount rate. And Steve was highlighting some inconsistencies with kind of the deterministic growth rate in different scenarios with constant discounting. I'm going to be talking about the problems when you think about uncertain growth. And I'll give you an example of why that's a problem. And then what I'll be doing is talking about this work with Richard and Brian, who's on the call, I think, and can help me answer the tough questions, about a way to calibrate and pick the rho and eta parameters that Steve was talking about. The other thing I'd like to try to get to is talking about another issue that Steve touched on, which was the use of 3 and 7% in current regulatory guidance. And as he mentioned, the IWG and most people who work on climate change have emphasized the appropriateness of a 3% or consumption rate versus 7%, which is usually associated with the return to capital. And what I'd like to do is talk about why the 7% is fundamentally wrong. But then I'd also like to talk about how you deal with the underlying concern, which Steve talked about, which is how do you reconcile using 3% with potential impacts on capital and investment? And we have an answer to that. So just jumping into this, so the problem, if the way I think about it, is imagine a stylized example where climate damages have to do with the size of the economy in the future, which is not crazy given if you think about things like mortality impacts, which typically are going to be related to how rich you are, or just damages to equipment and factories. It's going to depend on how many factories there are. And think about how that intersects with the possibility of uncertainty about growth and using a constant discount rate. So in the first line in this graph, I don't know if you guys, can you guys see the cursor when I do this, or does that not come across? All right, we'll just look at the first two rows of the table. And you'll see that if there's, imagine for a second with no growth over the next 200 years, we're talking about damages of $1. And then we think about what happens when there's growth of 2%. So the economy is 55 times larger. And that $1 damage, if it was proportionate to the size of the economy, would be $55. And then also think about a 4% growth scenario where now the economy is 3,000 times bigger, and that $1 damages proportional to the size of the economy is $3,000. If you were to discount those values at 3%, then what you find, not surprisingly, and you take the expected value, the average, is that the expected value is dominated by the highest growth rate scenario, the 4% growth rate scenario. And when you look at that, it's kind of intuitively displeasing, at least for most people, because it seems like, I mean, you would tend to think you would be worried about damages in the poorer states of the future, not the richer states of the future, where you're generally able to deal with these consequences. And this is what motivates the idea that Steve was talking about, the dynamic discounting or having the discount rate depend on the growth rate. And with uncertain states, if you have this function that the discount rate is 5%, is 0.5% plus 1.25 times the growth rate, then you get these present values in the very bottom row of this table. And for the parameterization I've chosen, in particular with eta, the coefficient on growth bigger than 1, you actually value the low growth scenarios more, and they dominate the calculation, which might kind of be with your intuition, that you're worried about the states of the world where you're poor and climate damages are going to hurt you more. And so that's kind of motivating the Ramsey discounting. So how do we actually figure out these parameters? So we have this idea that actually, first I have to talk about declining discount rates, and then I can tell you about our idea for how you figure out rho and eta. So declining discount rates is kind of related to the same idea I was just talking about. But imagine for a second that instead of the thing you're discounting being uncertain because of growth or something else, we actually know the value in the future. Let's say it's $1,000. And we're thinking about now the discount rate itself is uncertain. And this little table is an example from a paper with Ken Arrow and some others, where if you kind of think about discounting $1,000 in the future with different discount rates, the discount rate scenario that matters the most is actually the lowest discount rate scenario. And there's this result owing to Marty Weitzman that if you kind of look at the term structure of interest rates when there's discount rate uncertainty, you have this phenomena that the discount rates you would use over longer periods of time to discount a certain future value decline. So we're going to use this phenomena to actually figure out an estimate of rho and eta. How are we going to do that? Well, it turns out that there are two ways that you can get uncertainty about future discount rates, as well as this declining discount rate structure. One is you can just imagine discount rates are uncertain and not think about the model of what's driving them, but make them based on historical interest rate behavior. So there's a whole literature, and Steve actually cited this paper with Richard Newell that I wrote, where we look at historical interest rates, we build a model of time series interest rate behavior, we project them into the future, and we say that's the way you should discount using kind of future uncertain projections of interest rates. The other way you can get uncertainty about the future is you can have this Ramsey-like structural model where the discount rate depends on future growth, and growth is uncertain. So we're going to use these two things to actually calibrate rho and eta by taking the econometrically estimated models in item 2 there and equate them to a Ramsey-style discounting approach, item 1, where the growth rates are growth rates that we're going to actually use to calculate the social cost of carbon, or that we think are generally representative of what uncertainty about the future looks like. So just to make that a little bit more concrete, as I mentioned, all these different people have done these empirical studies. They've modeled interest rate behavior, and then they've used these to project into the future and construct a term structure. So this graph in the upper right shows you a term structure over the next 300 years for a discount rate based on work by Bauer and Rudebush, published in 2020. And we consider this to be like one way of calculating the future term structure of discount rates. The other way, as I mentioned, is to use future uncertainty about the growth rate and the Ramsey model to figure out what uncertainty about discount rates are, and then develop an alternative term structure. But obviously, rho and eta, we got to figure out. Well, we're going to pick rho and eta to actually match the term structure from Bauer and Rudebush. So if you try different values of rho and eta, you're going to get different term structures. So here are just a bunch of different dashed lines. So the solid black line is the term structure from Bauer and Rudebush that's driven by their model of discount rate, interest rate behavior. And then what we do is we try out different values of rho and eta and use the formula for figuring out what the term structure is from the Ramsey model to figure out what combination of rho and eta exactly matches that term structure. And it ends up, if you kind of calibrate to a near-term rate of 3%, to be a 0.8% value for rho and a 1.5 value of eta. I will say we also, in our paper, we also look at other rates. We can actually make this work down to 2%, and we can talk about what happens at lower rates during the discussion. So what I want to do now, I know I've raced through this, so maybe questions, is turn to the second question for a few minutes of 7% and how we deal with effects on capital. So the stylized motivation for 3 and 7% is kind of a tax wedge between consumption and investment. It doesn't totally explain the difference between investment and consumption rates. That is, when you invest in the market, you're not being charged, whatever that is, 60% taxes, but it's the bulk of the difference, or it's a large part of the difference between the arguments for 7 and 3%. So you imagine a household who's having to give up $1 for their climate change mitigation. What does that mean? And that dollar was going to go into productive capital. Well, there would have been a 7% or 7-cent return, for example, on that productive capital. A bunch of that gets taken out in taxes, and then the household only receives 3%. And so if you think about it for a second, for society gets the whole 7 cents. It should be looking for a return from that climate mitigation investment of 7 cents. A problem arises if you recognize that the capital that you didn't invest in probably does not last for an infinite amount of time. Let's say, for example, that piece of capital only lasted for 4 years. Well, in that case, you get paid the whole principal back after 4 years. And for the climate change mitigation project, it would need to have a 7% return for 4 years, but then it could have a much lower rate, 3%, for the rest of its lifetime. And you realize very quickly that what's at work here is trying to compare the pattern of climate benefits that you're discounting to the pattern of investment returns that you're giving up, which need not be the same thing. And in particular, what we point out in this paper is that, if you were discounting something, say the climate change consequences, and they had exactly the same pattern of capital returns, you could use 7% and that would be fine. But if the SEC is discounting things that have a longer horizon, you should use less than 7%. And if you're discounting something that had a shorter time horizon than capital, you would use more than 7%. But the point is there's actually a much better way to do this. And that's the shadow price of capital approach. And the idea is to recognize that we could get rid of this whole problem just by recognizing that a piece of capital is actually worth, in this particular example, 7/3 as much as $1 of investment, because at least if it goes on forever, it gives you this perpetuity of 7% return that you actually value your discounting at 3%. So all that stream of future returns is actually worth 7/3 of a dollar, versus a dollar you might have of consumption. Now, it turns out that the actual shadow price is going to depend on the pattern of capital returns, which are typically not a perpetuity, but they don't depend on the pattern of the social costs of the climate damages that you're discounting. And what we do, or what I do in this last document that I referenced, is just kind of look at different tax rates and different assumptions about depreciation and things like that to come up with a shadow price. And what I argue in that last document that I referenced on the first page of the slide was that a shadow price of about 1.2 would probably be a conservative estimate of the right shadow price to use when valuing the impacts on capital. So again, you wouldn't want to use 7% to represent the impacts of capital. What you want to do is gross up the cost by a factor of 20%. So let me, I realize that was kind of fast, and I'm sure we'll get into lots of discussions when we get through the presentations, but let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Billy. That was a quick addition of a number of additional complications. You actually finished about a minute early, so good on you for that. So to bring us home in this relay on the anchor leg and broaden our horizons, I predict even a little bit further, I'd like to call on Professor Deborah Lucas from MIT. Debbie. Are you there?
Sorry, I am here and I'm about to share. I just had to clear it up for a second. Apologies for wasting Billy's extra minute. And thank you very much for including me in this. Okay, just one more thing and I will be good to go. Okay, I think you can all see that. Yell if you can't. Okay, so I knew that this was going to add an element of complication into things, but I felt it was important to do this, which is maybe to preface it, I'll say that I've spent over the last 20 years of my career in various capacities trying to get governments to think about discounting all kinds of investments and financial obligations using a framework which is consistent with what I think is the basic economics of financial markets and economics. And so I wanted to kind of ambitiously go through and explain the logic of that and try to relate it to what you've heard. I should say right away that maybe there's some way of, to some extent, reconciling what Billy and others have talked about with this. But I just wanted you to see this perspective, and I wanted to start out just with, from the basics. So I apologize if it feels a little classroom lecture-y, but I think you'll see that it makes some pretty important points. So start with what a discount rate is, and then the framework that I want to suggest is what I would call a state pricing framework, which actually dates back to Arrow and DeBrew in the early 50s. I think that this is an approach that it provides intuition, consistency, generality. It really is the backbone of what I think of as the science of valuation. What, in terms of consistency, what I want to show you is that it gives us a way to think about risk-free rates and discount rates for stocks and pricing carbon and pricing abatement projects all in a very consistent sort of way. So just to kind of mention some of the takeaways at the beginning, in case I run out of time, I think it's very important that we shouldn't expect there to be a single discount rate that's appropriate for all climate-related analyses. In fact, what I think we need is a single, consistent, conceptual framework. And I feel like that's what we're, in a sense, debating today. I think that certainly incorporating risk is important, and the nature of the risks that are important is probably where what I'm going to describe and what Billy emphasized is, and Steve, is somewhat different. But in any case, I think incorporating the price of risk as I'm describing is pretty essential for credible cost benefit analysis. And I think also importantly, making meaningful cost comparisons across abatement alternatives. So I think also that market rates, not just risk-free rates, are natural starting points, but I agree with everyone that what we really need to do is to perhaps massage them if we want them to also incorporate social goals, intergenerational equity, biodiversity, and so forth. I'm going to be emphasizing that in the approach I'm talking about, a very critical determinant of the social discount rate for carbon is how correlated are the harms from CO2 with future economic activity. And I think where I'm going to end is to say that's a really hard correlation to get a handle on, and it creates a lot of uncertainty in the price of carbon. So people have already said this, but let me start at the beginning. So a discount rate is a tool to translate some future payoffs into an equivalent value today. And very often those payoffs are uncertain. So when we talk about reducing carbon by a ton, we know that the result of that in terms of benefits is going to vary considerably depending on what else is going on in the world. So, the simple, so what I want to do here is just, give a simple example of a discount rate, which I think you all know. But imagine that in 30 years, you have an investment that will either pay off $50, $150, $200 with various probabilities. And you see that today it's selling for $15.90. If you take the average of those payoffs weighted by the probability that they will happen, you can ask the question, what discount rate makes that $15.90 that I'm going to pay today equal to the present value of that expected 160 from this investment? So in this particular case, we infer that the discount rate that investors are using when they're competing to get the price at $15.90 is 8%. I guess the only point I want to make here is that prices and discount rates really contain the same information. So if I give you the price of something, I can figure out the discount rate. If I give you the discount rate, I can give you the price, assuming we agree on the expected future payoffs. Okay, so just to turn to this idea of state prices, which, as I mentioned, came from this gorgeous, beautiful work of Arrow and Deborah back in the early 50s, and kind of a seminal paper in 1954. But here's kind of the story. We're sitting here in 2020, and we're thinking about, say, possible outcomes for world GDP in 2052, 30 years into the future. So most likely it'll be higher than it is today, say 200 or 150 trillion dollars. But there's also the chance that something bad happens, and it's actually lower than it is today at about 50 trillion. By the way, world GDP is on order of 80 trillion today. So, okay, so this is what a state price approach says. This is really important. What it says is how much we're willing to pay today for a certain claim to $100 in the future is going to be different depending on whether the world economy is at 200 trillion, 150 trillion, or only at 50 trillion. So in particular, if you tell me how much I'm going to give you $100 in the high state of the world, how much would you pay for it today? Imagine that the market price, the state price, is $1.61, just for that promise of 100 in the high state. Well, if we look at the very low state, that same promise of $100 is worth a lot more. And this is very related to this marginal utility idea that in the future state of the world where output is very low, we're willing to pay a lot to move consumption from today into that low output state of the world. Okay, so these P's are going to be a function of how much you're getting, which I'm just normalizing to 100, and the future state of the world. And again, they represent what I'm willing to pay today for a promise of income in that future state 30 years in the future as a function of what happens to the economy. Okay, let's just very quickly see that once you have this framework, we can basically price any risky asset. So let me start with a risk-free bond. What does a risk-free bond do? Well, a risk-free bond that pays $100 in 30 years, no matter what the state of the economy is going to have a value today that's equivalent to buying one of each of these claims I just described, a claim that pays off 100 in the low state, 100 in the medium state, 100 in the high state. So buying one of these state claims for each of those states costs $21.85. And if we want to turn that price into an implied risk-free interest rate or a risk-free discount rate, we just take the price and we ask what discount rate makes the present value of that $100 in 30 years equal to that. And we find that the risk-free rate is 5.2%. Okay, so we can do, just very quickly, I know we want to talk about carbon and not stocks and bonds, but this is okay. We're almost done with stocks and bonds. Okay, so you could also imagine that you're trying to price something like a stock where that payout in 30 years is not going to be a constant as it is for a bond, but rather that payout is going to be positively correlated with the value of GDP, because we know stock returns will be higher if the economy is good, they'll be lower if it's bad. Okay, so we can, if we have an idea of what the stock will pay out in each of those aggregate economic states, we can ask how much are those future payoffs worth today by using our state prices and buying an appropriate package. So skipping all the algebra here, we conclude with that same set of state prices that in fact, the value of a stock that pays out $50 in the low state, 100 in the medium state, and 150 in the high state is $15.90 today. And taking those state prices and getting to the implied discount rate, we get a much higher discount rate of 8%. The intuition for why that discount rate is so much higher is because the marginal utility of the income it's creating in the very good state of the world just isn't that valuable. And since it's creating the most income, the better the state of the world, we discount at a higher rate. Okay, so now let's go to CO2. Okay, so let's ask the question using the same state price framework. What's the value today of reducing carbon emissions, say, by 1 ton? And let's assume, just for keeping things really simple, that all the damages are going to occur in year 30. Okay, so I actually want to talk about 2 possible cases. The first is that the damages are going to be proportional to GDP. And I think in some ways, Billy alluded to this a little bit. I mean, the idea is if the disruptions caused by climate change put some sand in the gears and say they reduce GDP by 15% from what would have otherwise been, those damages are still proportional. So the damages are going to be bigger if GDP were going to be higher, they're smaller if GDP were going to be lower. In that instance where the damages are proportional to GDP, what makes the pricing of the social cost of carbon consistent with the values of society, which are reflected in these state prices, would in fact be to discount at 8%. So the damages would in fact be discounted at 8%. Why is that? Because their risk profile and their correlation with consumption outcomes is really the same as what we called a stock before. Let me take a different, but there's a completely different case, not completely different, same framework, but a different situation. Weitzman and others, as also came up before, have emphasized that it's possible that the damages caused by carbon are really going to be concentrated in bad states of the world. And that's because the reason perhaps we have that very low consumption state of the world is because of the harm of climate change. And in that case, if we concentrate all the damages into that lowest GDP state, well, what can we conclude about the discount rate, which is consistent with society's values as reflected in this consistent set of state prices? If we do the algebra here, we conclude that we actually are going to pay a lot today to abate the carbon. And in fact, the implied discount rate in the example I've constructed here turns out to be negative. And if you think a negative discount rate is unusual, I'll say that very often, like if you look at the price of insurance and you look at the implied discount rate in those prices, insurance often does have a negative implied discount rate because you're actually willing to pay more. Your desire for insurance overcomes your rate of time preference. So the insurance value exceeds that rate of time preference. So you can wind up with a negative discount rate. So what do we have in this example? I want to emphasize that I engineered these numbers to give discount rates in the range of what people more broadly than was mentioned here, but I think are talking about, that we actually could be willing to pay a huge amount. We could discount at a negative number or zero even, to quite a high number. And the 8% here is kind of reminiscent of the OMB number, though for quite a different reason than what Billy suggested. So this implies, unfortunately, a range of implied social costs of 99 cents to $13.50 for $10 in expected damages 30 years down the road. And that's a very unsatisfactory state of affairs if you're trying to convince people to take the social cost of carbon as a serious number for policy choices. Before I leave the slide, I didn't mention, but I want to quickly say, where do these state prices come from? Well, you can get them from market prices, which is useful for some things, less useful for others. But I can also say that you could start with market prices and then massage them to reflect other goals like intergenerational equity. You can have them reflect some of the other ideas that came out before. So I didn't take a stand on where they came on here. All I did here was make sure that they reflected the idea that state prices are higher in states of the world where consumption is more scarce. Yeah, okay, good. I'm close. Okay, so I also want to emphasize that the social cost of carbon is the right rate, whatever it turns out to be, is right for thinking about the damages caused by carbon, but it's not the right discount rate for, say, an abatement project. And the general principle of financial economics is that the discount rate you use has to reflect the particular risks of the object that you're looking at. So if you're looking at the social cost of carbon, that's different than, say, building a seawall. And I'm mentioning this just because I have a PhD student here who was asking the question, is the social cost of carbon relevant to the MBTA in Boston deciding the value of a seawall? And it's certainly worth it. It's certainly necessary to figure out the discounted value of the benefits of the seawalls. But for project costs, you want to use the same principles. So as far as, this very important question of whether the discount rate should be greater than, equal to, or less than the risk-free rate, or even negative, it's interesting to say, well, what's likely to be the case? Smart people have argued both sides. There was this interesting publication in a finance journal where there was a survey of about 900 economists, and they were very split on whether whether the discount rate should be higher or lower than the risk-free rate, which is unfortunate. My personal intuition is it would be lower because the insurance idea is more compelling to me. If you haven't seen it, there's a nice book by my colleague Bob Pindyke on climate future, which goes through these things more carefully and talks about how other aspects of uncertainty, in particular the kind of options embedded in a lot of these decisions, effect value. So as far as how this relates to what others said earlier, Ramsey prices, non-constant interest rates, I would say if you're thoroughly confused at this point, though those other frameworks could be incorporated into this more general state pricing framework. They impose certain restrictions on those prices, but in my view, what's missing is they're abstracting from the price of other important risks. A lot of challenges in selecting discount rates. So my main conclusion is that the so-called right social cost of carbon is highly sensitive to discount rate choices, clearly, and there's a lot of variation in what that rate could be. I'm going to pose a question for a later discussion is how much do we really need to put a number on the social cost of carbon? Or do we really want to make policies based on that number? Or do we want to find something else to do given the huge amount of uncertainty involved? So let me stop there because I know I'm out of time. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Deborah. You did your job as advertised quite admirably, and even understood most of it myself. I do think the middle ground might be one you've already suggested. It maybe there could have been an agreed framework as opposed to an agreed number. Is that correct? So
That's
I don't
right.
see.
That's right. I think the framework is what I'm proposing to agree on. Yeah,
great. And Billy and Steve almost pushed in that direction with this risk adjusted and time dependent correlations and whatnot. So I'm actually, I'm less, I was going to say we didn't really expect to get a unified conclusion or framework out of this, but we may be closer than I would have anticipated. So thank you all for that. I wonder, I don't see any chat questions yet. If the speakers, I see Billy now has his hand up. If Billy, actually, if any of you would like to comment on what the other said, we could start with Billy because he's got his hand up already. Billy. I think you're muted.
Rookie mistake. Debbie, thanks for that very clear presentation. I apologize that I think I made another kind of classic blunder of wanting to cover too much of my presentation and covering none of it well. Because I actually think like what I was saying and what I understand of what you were saying are almost exactly the same in the sense that the thing I didn't really emphasize is that when we talk about using a Ramsey-like framework, we're talking about a fully state contingent approach. So the idea is that in every, you're thinking about uncertain consequences of climate change, or you have some model of climate change consequences that at a minimum typically depend on income or they don't depend on income, but that's part of your model or your econometric assessment of the impacts. And you do a stochastic simulation where you have different future states of the world, as in your case, that have different growth rates, and then they make different assumptions about how correlated the GDP outcomes are with the damage outcomes. And then you use the Ramsey framework to basically do a stochastic discounting of those different states of nature separately based on whatever the growth rate was. So what I kind of read into your slides was implicitly when you were doing the different valuations in the different states of nature, the high, medium, and low cases, you had in the back of your mind some sort of Ramsey discounting for those different growth rates. So I don't know that, I mean, you can tell me I was totally wrong interpreting it the way I wanted to, but, that's the platform, that basically RFF has put together, broader than just the discounting, to kind of take care of calculating the social cost of carbon in a fairly comprehensive way. And I should have been explicit that what I was really talking about was a stochastic discounting framework and not really trying to pull out a single discount rate per se. So I don't know if that affects anything you were saying or if you feel as much love between our presentations as I do, but I was kind of reassured.
Debbie.
Meg, so I know, Billy, from our past conversations that I actually thought that we were pretty close on this, but I think it's going to be a devil in the details set of issues. So let me just say that the object, it's going to be about things like what objects you choose to look at empirically. So when you suggest doing something like looking at the historical volatility of interest rates, I would say, well, those interest rates are, you're actually, I think, looking at the historical volatility of treasury rates, and those don't capture the market pricing of risk in, you know, the GDP sensitive kind of risk. That's in fact variation in that's reflecting variation in the pricing of risk-free claims. So I think I do believe, I said at the end, maybe quickly, that I believe that any state pricing framework can accommodate your set of assumptions, but I believe, to be nerdy about it, you're constraining the space of outcomes that are highly relevant in a different way than I would. So I think it's great that we agree on, you know, broad framework, but then we have to think about what price to risk is relevant and whether it's being incorporated in the way we look at the world and data.
Steve.
Sorry, too many mutes. Yeah, actually, just to chime in on this conversation and also to make a similar observation, you know, in looking at the behavior that you were characterizing, Debbie, it was the kind of behavior that you would get from that Ramsey construction. So I was kind of assured of that. I'm not saying that there aren't the kinds of issues you were just highlighting with respect to constraints and the absence of maybe thinking further about risk. But seeing directionally how things were behaving, it does raise the question of actually having feedbacks from climate damages to the growth assumptions, which is something that's not currently part of the existing frameworks, because that's really moving to a fully endogenous framework that is, I guess I would say, out of reach at the moment, given where we are now with the current state of the art. So that was I don't know if you share that perspective, but it looked to me that, you know, from a behavioral point of view of how things are responding to in terms of the different examples you gave, it was what I would expect in terms of the Ramsey formulation as well. One other thing that occurred to me, and this actually kind of goes, I guess one is a question to you, Debbie, and then also a question to Billy. To Billy, let me start there since what we're focused on, and that is, I was trying to think about whether or not it makes sense to essentially apply the certainty equivalent structure to the calibration process. It's not obvious to me that it does, and so maybe you could say a little bit more about trying to convincing me why it does. I think about, so we're not doing stochastic modeling in this context. Right, so we don't have that stochasticity in terms of the interest rate. We are doing deterministic projections with a whole variety of different sensitivities, right, different scenarios. So in each one of those deterministic scenarios, I would think we need to have essentially a consistent discounting structure where imposing the certainty equivalent would essentially make for an inconsistency. Because we're not doing stochastic modeling. So anyway, that was just a reaction there. And then Debbie, back to you. You talked about sort of the fact that we should expect different discounting for different parts of this. And I understand why. I guess I'm kind of wondering, how do we then bring together that information, right? So I think that there is a challenge here and a problem in some ways, in terms of combining things that in some ways are apples and oranges because of the way they're representing different kinds of trade-offs. So maybe you can think about, so what would your recommendation be to EPA and the other agencies in that regard?
What, Debbie or Billy, do you want to respond?
Of these tech companies don't let their children actually use, like what Steve Jobs did.
Sure. I mean, I can jump in, and then maybe I'll throw out another question for Debbie as well. So to Steve's, Steve asked about using these, kind of matching these two term structures in order to determine the parameters. I didn't even go into all the details of exactly how we propose to do this, but one of the things that we proposed in the paper And again, this is somewhat grounded in the fact that, we're trying to provide policy advice to the U.S. government in terms of how it can modify A4. And, lurking in the guts of A4 is the idea that there is some near-term interest rate that people have in mind. 3%, maybe it'll be changed to something else, or 7%, maybe it'll be changed to something else. And regardless of what data we use to, estimate a behavior of interest rates and try to project into the future what that implies about future term structures, there's no reason to think it's going to match the policy parameter that OMB chooses, given the data, whatever data set we choose to use. So, what we do in our simulations is we take the behavior, the time series behavior of interest rates, and we take that, but we actually fix the near-term rate. And then we allow the time series behavior to fluctuate off of that fixed near-term rate. So the thing that we're calibrating rho and eta to is already not quite, past behavior. But I think there is this logic that, again, if you think about the spirit of A4, it's taking these, it's kind of grounding itself primarily in a descriptive approach of what market rates tell us about returns to capital and maybe something about consumption preferences. And if you believe that, then you kind of believe that we should be using something about the empirical behavior of market rates to define the term structure. And then the puzzle is simply we have this, our best guess from Mueller, Stock, and Watson about what future growth looks like. What are the parameters of rho and eta that would deliver the same term structure that are kind of implied by this hybrid of OMB policy choice of discount rate and, kind of stochastic behavior of uncertainty about the future from the time series of interest rate data. So that's my best assessment or answer to your question. I would invite Brian, if he wants to jump in at any point, to potentially join that, if that's permissible. But I did want to ask Debbie one question because, I kind of, implicit in what in your comments was the idea, and it was certainly a hope of mine, that we could find historical evidence that would relate observed market rates to different growth rates in consumption. And because that's kind of what you're implying in your slides, is that in these very high growth scenarios for the future, we should have more discounting than we have in the very low growth states of the future. Yet my understanding of the literature is there's very little evidence that consumption growth is related to observed market rates. So that's kind of a disconnect that we had to, rectify, and we kind of rectified by just saying we're going to use the Ramsey formula, even if we don't see evidence in the data that, observed market rates correlate with consumption growth. So I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me say something about this whole issue of how I would implement things and what I would tell the government to do. So what I have been asking the government to do for decades is to adopt generally a fair value framework for discounting. And that would mean that you would be looking for to impute rates on government projects or government costs from market prices of projects that you think have a similar risk profile in terms of priced risks. And I think we actually have very strong evidence that non-diversifiable risk is priced, and it's how we understand that stocks have a higher average return than bonds. So that whole exercise of saying that people discounted something stock-like, and I was only loosely saying stocks are correlated with consumption, but they are to some extent, and certainly over long horizons. If the economy does very well, the stock market does very well, and vice versa. So there's this consumption correlation of asset returns. And so I think the critical question for what I would be recommending would be just how correlated, as I said, are the harms of carbon with aggregate growth. And I feel like it's a bit, this is a little strong, but I feel it's a sideshow to be worrying about the volatility of observed interest rates. I mean, the fundamental question is, what's the nature of the risk? And is it going to hurt us? Is it going to hit us hardest when things are bad? Or is it just going to be kind of a decrease, a more even decrease over different states of the world? And that is what has a first order implication for the discount rate you choose. I was going to say, I've talked to OMB about this, and it depends on the administration. So, you know, right now they do allow some flexibility actually for market rates from that 7%. So, or at least they did under the last administration. So, you know, they do allow a little bit of flexibility. I might say that other parts of the government do use the entire term structure of the Treasury yield curve. So, for instance, the thing I work on the most, which is government credit programs, by law, assess cost using the whole current Treasury yield curve. So there's actually a lot of directives floating around there. But I think moving to a valuation framework, when I say fair value, what I really mean is a framework which is consistent with how the private sector evaluates investment projects. And aside from believing that that brings the aggregated wisdom of markets into thinking about the value of future cash flows, I also think it provides a certain communication and common ground consistency, which is really valuable for credibility. So I can see that for you, the idea of Ramsey prices has kind of taken on a realness, which I'm finding interesting, and I'm trying to get my mind around because I haven't really thought about it that way. But my sense of the world, the people in corporations and just decision makers in the kind of space of business and finance have never thought about Ramsey prices, but they have learned textbook finance and the idea that higher risk, higher return and all that. So I guess a question I have for you all is how you got to this point of being comfortable with taking this thing that came out of usually a certainty framework in public finance and bringing it to this sphere.
I don't actually see I'm told there are some questions in the chat box regarding equity. I actually don't see it on my screen. Steve or Heidi, do you want to ask them?
Sure, I can read them out. So there's two questions there for all of us. One is folks would like to hear more about the importance of making decisions based on ages of today's population. Lower discount rates being more helpful to today's youth. So there's a question there about whether we have something to say. And somewhat related, would anyone on the panel care to comment on more on intergenerational equity? So I'll see if others want to take that, and then I'll offer some thoughts.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, Debbie, since you've worked on Social Security, that's the closest thing to climate I can think of in terms of intergenerational stuff.
Right. I would say I like to take equity. So there's always a question of what you adjust in the numerator in cash flows and what you adjust in the denominator, the discount rate. I think it's much more transparent to increase the value, say, of mitigation in the future, recognizing that you're concerned with social goals and actually thinking about, well, how much more is the cost because of this adjustment? Because the problem with discount rates is any change you make is compounded in this very nonlinear way. And that effect is just mechanically different at every different horizon. And it's really hard to even know what you want to get with a discount rate adjustment. So I would throw it to the benefit side and take it out of the discount rate discussion. I think making discount rates this complicated is really problematic. Even more problematic.
Steve, you said there was another question.
Oh, I read both of them. So one was specifically about intergenerational equity, and the other was similar. I was sort of asking about whether we might make adjustments to discount rates based on the age of today's population. So the example that they gave was a lower discount rate being more helpful to today's youth. So pretty the same issue being raised. I'll just offer a couple of thoughts, and this kind of just to reiterate, but maybe with a bit more background to it. The point I was trying to make earlier is, one issue here in the context of trying to provide a metric that informs regulatory decisions and other public policy decisions is in some ways the need to ensure that it doesn't have any kind of policy objectives in it. So it's not trying to achieve some kind of goal or correction on its own. And that's an argument for that is one, because it provides us not having that information there ensures that we have information from those metrics that's just informing our decisions in terms of evaluating the implications of those policies. Another argument for it is once you make it into a policy lever, is now you've made it vulnerable to changes in governments. And so you would potentially see more instability in those estimates. And I think what we want here is really something that's going to stand the test of time. It's grounded in science, and it'll be something that's available to us across administrations and usefully informing decisions.
So I think we have to wrap up pretty soon. I had one kind of interesting thought floated into my mind based on this Debbie's presentation and the give and take after it. Historically, there was this kind of interesting debate between the real options folks and the decision analysis folks. People probably know the Smith and Now paper. Actually, Smith was at Duke Business School at the time they wrote that paper. And it basically said, you can kind of get the same results out of a real options investment. This is private sector approach, or a classical decision analysis approach. But then the interesting dialogue came out, and that was regarding the extent to which, in doing so, you relied on public market information versus what they call private information, say internally held by a company. I think the analogy isn't perfect here, but I gather from what all three of you have said, there might be some other thing that needs to be married in a useful way into the kind of the wisdom of markets, if I could call it that. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. So I guess in wrapping up the great presentations, the audience interventions, and the cross-panel dynamics, I say I am kind of more optimistic now that this group and a few friends could actually develop a practical framework that could actually ultimately get into the work of the IWG. I know we have IWG people in the audience, so I may be overstating it. So I hope the group will in some way persist. So it need not be stationary. It need not be a single method, but a framework in which there may be different pieces even for different categories of investments. So with that said, because we now are out of time, I'd like to thank the panelists for great presentations, and the audience and cross-panel dynamics for additional insights. And last but not least, thank our friends at the Electric Power Research Institute. I think you've achieved your general objectives, EPRI-wise, and your objectives for this particular seminar series really admirably. And I'd like to turn it back to Heidi and Steve to close this out here. Heidi.
Thank you so much, John. And I just want to echo John's thank you to our entire panel. I think this is a great conversation. And I just wanted to make a note before we wrap up for today that we will send out all of the materials from today's webcast, and all those materials will also be available on our website, which is here on this slide. Steve, anything from you?